Hi, I'm Tony Russo, and this is In Case You Missed It from Kates-Boylston for the week ending Friday, August 15th, 2025. We got a ton of great stuff. Actually, not a ton, but a couple of stories we can dig our teeth into, so we'll pretend that's the same thing as having a ton of stuff. But before we get to that, I want to let you listen to this message from our friends and sponsors at Starmark.
Funeral service is more than a profession. It's a calling. Starmark understands the care, dignity, and efficiency you need to provide for the families you serve. That's why we specialize in sensible product solutions designed to meet your needs. If you're looking for sustainable, economical, and efficient container and casket solutions, Starmark is here to support you. Because presentation means everything, you deserve a partner you can trust. Starmark, the cremation solutions leader. Visit starmarkcp.com today and discover the difference.
First up, I want to talk to you about this week's main feature in Funeral Service Insider, which is based on a conversation I had with Carriage CEO Carlos Quesada. He talked to me about several of the things that they have going on now and to go forward. One thing that, I let it slip by earlier in the year, and it's too late to really cover it now, but they rolled out a new system, computer system, management system, company-wide. And I think this is working for them in ways that they're almost, not shouting from the rooftops because maybe they're working too well. But it was a factor that he mentioned in our conversation. And it was a factor that Carlos has been mentioning in their earnings calls, this kind of making sure that everyone's on the same page financially. And, that was one of the things that he really kind of touted as a success, was the way that they've been able to generate more revenue without having, with death rates kind of staying the same. So I think they did less than 2% more calls, but they made a ton more in margins this year. And one of the reasons that they did that had to do with these divestitures, and that's one of the things that we talked about for the story in this week's Funeral Service Insider. They are more interested in margins and efficiencies and, let's call them, proper funerals, that is memorialized funerals, than they are in just racking up volume. So one of the things is that they're not really that heavy into direct cremation, which was something that was interesting to hear. The idea is, if you pretend that direct cremation isn't an option, I guess, for your sales folks, and they have to do, quote, better than that, maybe they'll have some success, because that's really what has been driving Carriage. It's one of the things that's been driving Carriage, is taking what could have been a direct cremation and making it into a direct cremation plus, and not worrying about getting direct cremation business. It's, as Carlos kind of put it, not business worth fighting for. You have 10 people fighting over a $750 direct cremation. There's not only not a lot of margin in it, but there's also, increasingly bad things have been happening with direct cremation. We see it in the news. I've got a story about it coming up later, and the risk to reward just isn't necessarily there. But what was really interesting to me, one of the things, if you've been listening and reading for the last 2 years, I'm really interested in this whole event center notion, this idea of celebrations of life centers and event centers, and how funeral homes can kind of be changing. And I, broached that with Carlos, with the idea that he would say, oh yeah, we're doing this, that, and the other thing with these event centers. And it's not that they're not, but what he used that question for was an opportunity to talk about how hospitality is the most important thing, and having a big space to have a party is kind of secondary. And so as they look for ways to do more celebrations of life and events in their funeral homes, what they're starting with is just kind of this culture of hospitality beyond that. And once they have, he said, this kind of hospitality mindset pervading the company, it will be easier to get everyone on board for how to elevate the experience in the funeral home as a funeral home. And that it doesn't have to necessarily be a great big event center. I mean, those are great, and as I said, I'm a huge fan of them. But his take was the hospitality is where it starts, and this culture of hospitality is a place where they hope to grow their event business from in the future. Anyway, there's a link to the story in the show notes. I think it's worth reading. We have more news about Shepherd Memorial Park. And now, if you're new, if this is your first episode, we've been covering this on and off for, I feel like, at least a couple of months and maybe longer. The story, the short version, is that Shepherd Memorial Park can't be kept by the current owner. It is in debt and insolvent, and also in a lot of trouble for different mismanagement issues that arose when the owner died, or before the owner died. And so there was an auction and no one bid on it. And then eventually Jimmy Altmeyer, who is a kind of a big name in funeral service on the East Coast here, was able to successfully bid $340,000 for the property. And that is where we left it. And now I'm going to pick up from you. I wrote something down just so it's clear. The court-ordered sale of Shepherd Memorial Park has been temporarily halted by a unanimous decision from the North Carolina Court of Appeals. This pause comes after Altmeyer Funeral Services was declared the highest bidder, but the cemetery's attorney argued that the proceeding with the sale would cause irreparable harm and moot their appeal. And moot means make it the same thing. It's already stated. The attorney asserts that the trial judge exceeded his authority by limiting bids and ordering the sale, further contending that the North Carolina Cemetery Commission lacked the power to force the sale. The appeals court's decision suggests that there may be merit in these arguments, and that's from the winning lawyer. So what happened was at the bottom of this is the judge set a floor for the bids originally, and no one met the floor, and that was a problem. So then he just reopened it at a different level, and that's what gave Altmeyer the opportunity to be the highest bidder. So if there shouldn't have been a floor, maybe there'll be a new auction. Maybe they'll return it to the owners. I don't know what the next steps are. This is actually breaking today as I record this on August 14th. We just got this news. So, I'll try to dig into some more over the coming weeks. Every time I decide that I'm going to call Mr. Altmeyer and ask him, to tell me this, epic tale, there's another chapter added. So hopefully we'll have some more information for you in the future. But for now, there's a link to the most recent story, which has links to all the past stories in the show notes. Over the last couple of weeks, actually, really since I've started, I always see a lot of, cremation mistake stories or cremation mistake lawsuits, and it's just something that sticks with me. And I think that I've mentioned before, probably last week, that I like to separate people who are just in over their heads from people who are absolute scam artists. And this is a story of a person who I think may just be over their head, but I don't think it matters. When eventually, once you get too far over your head, you get too far over your head. And I want to talk about McDermott's Funeral Home and Cremation Services, which is in Las Vegas and had its license permanently revoked by the Nevada State Board of Funeral and Cemetery Services. The board's decision came after an investigation revealed a disturbing backlog of 8 uncremated bodies, some of which had been left for more than 10 months. There have been complaints from neighbors. There have been complaints from customers. There have been, lots of complaints. In the show notes, there is a link not only to the news story about this, but also to the Yelp page and to the Google business page for this company. The Yelp page has an interesting excerpt. The best review was a person who unfortunately had a couple of burials, first her mother and then her brother, or vice versa, and one was $650 and the other one was only $1,300 several years later. And so, this is just saying, how great it was to have this inexpensive service available. But the problem is that he continued to take all of this business when he couldn't really get everything processed. We mentioned this, I think, last week. I know that I read the story for the first time last week because his original defense was that the bodies that were there because he was waiting on an okay from the state, that he was waiting on death certificates. And it turned out that there may have been some for which he didn't have death certificates or permission to cremate them from the state. As I think of it now, he didn't want to not get paid. That's what it was. He didn't have the state's confirmation that they would pay for these indigent burials, and that's what made up a chunk of the bodies that he had stored. And there aren't any accusations that they were improperly stored, just that they were stored for too long. There were some that were 50 days that were mentioned as well. So they finally, after discussion, revoked his license, and this is the second time that he's been in trouble for things like this. So one has to say learn your lesson, at least when it comes to getting these bodies processed. If you don't have the staffing, or if you don't have the facilities, then you have to turn people away. Otherwise, again, you get these backups, and when you're doing this kind of, no pun intended, turn and burn work, you're just asking for trouble. I feel like even an honest man, especially an honest man, is really susceptible to just the kind of mistakes that can happen when you take on more than you're able to handle. So anyway, there's a link to that in the show notes. And also, again, not to kick anyone where they're down, but this is a good opportunity to look at your own Google business page. The gentleman who runs this funeral home had his Google business page hooked up to his regular photos. So there are photos of him on vacation. There are photos of him out and about, and there are also photos of him, as a businessman in front of his business. Check the photos on your Google business page. Check them now, delete them if they're not appropriate, and make sure that you are using your Google business app and not your regular picture app to add photos to your business page, to any of your business pages, unless you're doing this kind of brand building, which I'll tell you about on a second. If you're a regular listener, you've already heard possibly Aaron Butler's short brief introduction episode where he talked about building your brand as a funeral director. And in that last section where I was editorializing a bit about watching what you put on your Google business page. I guess I want to walk that back a little bit and say, unless you're trying to build this kind of influencer style relationship. But again, make sure you know what you're posting online associated with your business, as long as it's intentional. And that's one of the things that Aaron and I talked about, is how to make it intentional and authentic. And then, how to use AI to expand it and share it and things like that. So if you haven't heard that podcast, go back. It's the last episode. It came out on Wednesday, August 13th. And if you'd like, you can join us. We are having a virtual event on September 17th, and you can register for that with the link in the show notes. Just go to Kates-Boylston.com. In this week's installation of the Texas Funeral Service Commission saga, the commission has decided not to sue the two lawyers it had fired, Sarah Sanders and Christopher Burnett. I didn't get to tell you that they sued them, because it has happened that quickly. They issued the suit, link to that in the show notes, and then withdrew the suit, link to that in the show notes. They did not say why they decided not to sue the two lawyers, but I've got a couple notes here on what precisely their concerns were. In addition to coming out in defense of the fired executive director, they made their own accusations against the board, and were accused of recording evidence to show that the board was indeed the problem when it came to understaffing and poor management, and not following up on inspections, that these were all board decisions and not the decisions of Mr. Bingaman, who was the executive director who was fired. And I guess the idea was that these first the lawyers were fired without cause, and then they were sued for sharing proprietary information and breaching attorney-client privilege. But all of those things were dropped as soon as they were out. So while this has not gone away, we just got a really interesting bump in the road. So they're sued and they're not sued. I probably should have started the show with they're sued, which I had, and then ended it with no, they're not, which I just got. But I didn't do that, and it's just as well. But anyway, a link to all the stories in this saga in the show notes. I reached out to someone who's following it closely in Texas, and maybe we'll be able to have them on the show to chat about it, or maybe I'll get a story done. But as soon as I have more on it, I'd be happy to share it with you. In kind of late breaking news, I'll put a link to this in the show notes. Tribute Technologies announced that they're having a great year financially, and that their numbers are up. I reached back out to them and said, well, what were they and what are they? But the person in charge of that is away for the weekend, and good for them. So we will hopefully follow up with that story next time, but they're very proud of their success so far. So I'll have a link in the show notes to the press release, and if I can get my hands on the earnings call, or if I get to talk to them about the earnings differentials this year over last year, I'll share that next week. And that will do it for this time. In case you missed it, is a Kates-Boylston production. It was written and edited by me, Tony Russo. Please click the link in the show notes to subscribe. We have a subscribe button now that will take you to a page, and on that page is every conceivable podcatcher. So you just go to that page and then click on whichever podcatcher you have on your phone, and it'll get you all signed up, and then you'll get notified when we have a new show out, which is going to be 3 days next week. I'm very excited. We will have on Monday, we have our feature podcast, and then on Wednesday we have a bonus episode. I spoke with Cole Wainbright from Homesteaders about some of the things that he's got going on. And then, of course, we will be back next Friday with In Case You Missed It from Kates-Boylston. But for now, we're going to call it a week. We're going to call it a weekend, and I will check in with you next time.